I'm Marcus Chen, 68 years old, and I've been working at Peterson Tech Solutions for 15 years as their senior logistics coordinator. Last Tuesday, during what I thought was a routine quarterly meeting, my 34-year-old boss Jake laughed and said, "Maybe it's time Grandpa should retire and make room for fresh blood." The entire conference room went silent as 20 pairs of eyes stared at me. What Jake didn't know was that his grandpa was a decorated Marine Corps veteran who'd spent 3 tours managing supply chains in Afghanistan, and his company was about to face the biggest crisis in its history. In 48 hours, I would use my wartime experience to save Peterson Tech from complete collapse, turning his mockery into the most expensive mistake of his career. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, you're going to want to hear this story. What happened next will shock you. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Like this video if you've ever had your entire life turned upside down by a single moment. But let me back up and tell you how I got here. 20 years I served in the Marine Corps, starting as an 18-year-old kid from San Francisco's Chinatown who thought he knew everything. The military taught me otherwise, fast. I specialized in logistics coordination, which sounds boring until you realize that in a war zone, logistics means the difference between life and death. Every meal, every bullet, every piece of equipment that reaches our soldiers depends on someone like me making sure supply lines stay open. My service record tells the story better than I ever could. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Navy Commendation Medal for innovative supply chain management under enemy fire. I wasn't just pushing papers, I was solving problems that generals couldn't figure out. When traditional supply routes got cut off by insurgent activity, I found ways to get critical supplies through mountain passes that weren't even on the maps. When corrupt local contractors tried to hold up medical supplies, I built alternative networks using tribal connections and bartering systems that would make a Wall Street trader jealous. The 3rd tour was the hardest. By then, I was 41 years old, a staff sergeant with enough experience to know when things were going sideways. Our forward operating base was getting hit almost daily, and our usual supply convoy routes had become death traps. The brass was ready to pull back operations, which would have meant abandoning local allies who'd risked everything to help us. That's when I developed what became known as the Chen Protocol, a decentralized supply network, using multiple small deliveries instead of large convoys, coordinated through local contacts and timed to avoid predictable patterns. It worked. Not only did we keep the base supplied, but we actually improved delivery times and reduced costs by 30%. The Pentagon was so impressed, they wanted to implement the system servers-wide. That's when I knew it was time to come home. My wife Sarah had been holding down our household in San Diego for 2 decades, and I'd missed too much of my kids' lives already. Civilian life was harder than I expected. Sarah and I had grown apart during those years of deployment, and my adult children, David and Lisa, felt like strangers. I'd missed baseball games, graduation ceremonies, first dates, college orientations. When I tried to connect, my attempts felt forced and awkward. I was used to giving orders and having them followed, not negotiating bedtimes and curfews with teenagers who barely knew me. Sarah passed away from cancer 3 years after my final return. The kids blamed me, and honestly, I blamed myself too. If I'd been there more, maybe I would have noticed the symptoms earlier. Maybe I could have convinced her to see doctors sooner. The guilt ate at me, and my relationship with David and Lisa deteriorated further. They saw their father as someone who chose military service over family, who came home expecting to pick up where he'd left off. That's when I found Peterson Tech Solutions. The company specialized in industrial equipment distribution, and they needed someone who understood complex logistics. My military experience translated perfectly, managing supply chains for construction. Equipment wasn't that different from coordinating military supplies, just with different stakes. Instead of lives hanging in the balance, it was project deadlines and profit margins. For the first 12 years, it was perfect. The founder, Robert Peterson, was a Vietnam veteran himself. He appreciated what I brought to the table and gave me the autonomy to revolutionize their distribution network. I implemented modified versions of systems I'd developed in Afghanistan, improving delivery times and reducing costs across the board. The company grew from a regional player to a national presence, and I was promoted to senior logistics coordinator. With a team of 8 people reporting to me, Robert treated me like the experienced professional I was. He'd often pull me into strategic planning meetings, asking for my input on expansion plans and operational challenges. My age wasn't a liability, it was an asset. My gray hair represented experience, wisdom, lessons learned through trial and error in situations where mistakes had real consequences. But Robert retired 5 years ago, selling the company to a venture capital firm that installed younger management. That's when Jake Morrison arrived, fresh from business school with an MBA and theories about disrupting traditional supply chain paradigms. At 29, he was younger than both my children, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never failed at anything important. The changes were gradual at first. Jake would make comments about bringing fresh energy to the team and leveraging digital natives for competitive advantage. Older employees started getting performance reviews that questioned their adaptability and technological fluency. The company began hiring recent graduates for positions that used to go to experienced professionals. The shift became impossible to ignore. Once Jake got promoted to operations director 2 years ago, suddenly, my 15 years of institutional knowledge meant nothing compared to whatever buzzword-filled presentation the latest hire had put together. Jake started scheduling important meetings during times when he knew older employees had medical appointments or family obligations. He'd send critical updates through new communication platforms that he knew we'd struggle with, then act surprised when we missed information. My performance reviews, which had been consistently excellent for over a decade, suddenly included comments about my resistance to change and difficulty adapting to new technologies. This was particularly galling because I'd been the one to implement most of our current tracking systems in the first place. I'd taught half the company how to use the logistics software that Jake now acted like he'd invented. The worst part was watching it happen to others too. Margaret Walsh, our 58-year-old accounts receivable manager, got written up for communication issues after she asked Jake to explain a new procedure in writing rather than just verbally. Tom Rodriguez, who'd been with the company for 18 years, found himself suddenly excluded from client meetings he'd been running for the past decade. We were being systematically marginalized, our expertise dismissed as old-school thinking. Jake had his favorites, young employees who nodded along with his ideas and adopted his vocabulary of synergies and paradigm shifts. They got the choice assignments, the professional development opportunities, the face time with senior management. Those of us over 50 found ourselves increasingly relegated to routine tasks. Our input rarely sought and often ignored when offered. I tried to push back professionally. When Jake proposed changing our supplier evaluation process, I prepared a detailed analysis showing how his suggested approach would increase costs and reduce reliability. I backed up every point with data from our actual operations, comparing performance metrics across different suppliers and logistics approaches. Jake's response was to schedule a team meeting where he presented his plan as a collaborative effort while barely acknowledging my input. During that meeting, I watched as Jake dismissed my concerns with patronizing comments about being open to innovation and not getting stuck in legacy thinking. The younger employees nodded along, either genuinely convinced or smart enough to read the political winds. Those closer to my age sat quietly, recognizing the futility of arguing with someone who'd already made up his mind. The isolation was the hardest part. In the military, age and experience commanded respect. A 40-year-old staff sergeant didn't have to prove his worth to 25-year-old lieutenants. The system itself recognized the value of experience. But in Jake's Peterson Tech, experience was treated like a liability, something to be overcome rather than leveraged. I started eating lunch alone, finding that conversations with younger colleagues felt strained and artificial. They'd talk about apps I'd never heard of, make references to shows I'd never watched, discuss career strategies that assumed rapid job hopping and constant self-promotion. Meanwhile, my approach, steady competence, institutional knowledge, long-term thinking was treated as outdated. The breaking point came 6 months ago, when Jake restructured the logistics department. He created a new position called Supply Chain Innovation Specialist and hired 26-year-old Amanda Stevens, fresh from a consulting firm, to fill it. Amanda had never worked in distribution, had never managed an actual supply chain, but she had impressive PowerPoint skills and spoke fluently in business jargon. Jake announced that Amanda would be partnering with senior team members to identify optimization opportunities. In practice, this meant she'd be second-guessing decisions I'd been making successfully for 15 years. Armed with theories from business school, but no understanding of our actual operations, our specific challenges, or our client relationships. The final insult was when Jake started scheduling knowledge transfer sessions, where Amanda would interview me about our processes, supposedly to capture institutional knowledge and identify best practices. But these sessions felt more like interrogations, with Amanda asking pointed questions about why we did things certain ways, clearly looking for inefficiencies to highlight in her reports to Jake. I realized then that they weren't trying to leverage my experience, they were trying to extract it, document it, and then replace me with someone younger and cheaper. My knowledge would remain, but I wouldn't. It was like being slowly erased from a company I'd helped build. Everything changed on Monday morning, October 15th. I was reviewing shipping manifests in my cubicle. Yes, they'd moved me from an office to a cubicle during the latest space optimization initiative when my phone started buzzing with emergency alerts from our overseas suppliers. The first call came from Chen Industries in Taiwan, no relation despite the shared surname. Their production manager, someone I'd worked with for 8 years, sounded genuinely panicked. "Marcus, we have a serious problem. The government here just issued an emergency shutdown order for our entire industrial district. Some kind of environmental contamination issue. They're saying it could be weeks, maybe months before we can resume operations." Chen Industries manufactured 60% of our Q4 product line, specialized industrial pumps and hydraulic components that our biggest clients depended on for their year-end projects. We're talking about $12 million in confirmed orders, with penalty clauses that would cost us another $8 million if we couldn't deliver on time. Before I could fully process that information, the second call came from our secondary supplier in Malaysia. Political unrest had shut down their shipping ports indefinitely. Even if we could source replacement products, we'd have no way to get them out of the country. The third call was from our logistics partner in Singapore, explaining that the ripple effects were spreading throughout the entire Southeast Asian supply network in 30 minutes. I watched 15 years of carefully constructed supply relationships collapse like dominoes. The emergency supply chain alert I'd received was just the beginning. This was a perfect storm of circumstances that threatened to destroy not just our Q4 numbers, but the entire company's survival. I immediately started running calculations in my head, the same kind of rapid threat assessment I'd done countless times in Afghanistan, when supply convoys got hit or routes got compromised. The numbers were stark. Peterson Tech had exactly 47 days of existing inventory to fulfill, $20 million in contractual obligations. After that, we'd be in breach of contract with our 3 largest clients, facing not just lost revenue but massive penalty payments. My military training kicked in automatically. Step 1. Assess the full scope of the crisis. Step 2. Identify alternative resources and routes. Step 3. Calculate realistic timelines for different scenarios. Step 4. Brief leadership and recommend immediate actions. But as I reached for my phone to call Jake, I realized something that stopped me cold. This was exactly the kind of situation where my experience would be invaluable, where my unconventional problem-solving approach could make the difference between survival and catastrophe. This was the moment when a smart leader would set aside personal conflicts and leverage every available resource. Jake wasn't that kind of leader. I'd seen him handle smaller crises before, and his approach was always the same: panic, blame, and then throw money at the problem until it went away. But this crisis couldn't be solved with money alone. It required the kind of creative thinking and relationship building that only came from decades of experience managing supply chains under impossible conditions. I walked to Jake's office, emergency alert still buzzing on my phone, and found him hunched over his computer, frantically making phone calls. Through his glass door, I could see the stress on his face as he tried to explain to someone, probably his boss, why our entire Q4 pipeline had just evaporated. When he finally looked up and saw me standing there, his expression shifted from panic to irritation. "What do you want, Marcus? Can't you see I'm dealing with a crisis here?" "I know about the supply chain disruptions," I said, holding up my phone. "I've been getting alerts from our partners all morning. I think I can help." Jake's laugh was bitter. "Help, Marcus? This isn't some small logistics hiccup that you can fix with your old-fashioned methods. This is a global supply chain crisis that requires sophisticated solutions. Amanda is already working on alternative sourcing strategies using our new digital platforms." Through his office window, I could see Amanda at her desk, furiously typing on her laptop while surrounded by printouts and sticky notes. She looked overwhelmed, and I didn't blame her. This was like asking someone who'd learned to drive in a parking lot to suddenly navigate a NASCAR race. "Jake, I've dealt with supply disruptions before. In Afghanistan, This isn't Afghanistan, Marcus," he interrupted. "This is modern business. We need real solutions, not war stories." I stood there for a moment, feeling the familiar sting of dismissal. But underneath the hurt, something else was building, a cold, analytical clarity that I recognized from my military days. This was the moment when emotion had to give way to strategy, when personal feelings became a luxury that could cost lives, or, in this case, jobs. "Understood," I said simply, and walked back to my cubicle. But as I sat down and looked at my computer screen, I realized something that Jake hadn't considered. He'd just dismissed the one person in the company who had successfully navigated this exact type of crisis before. More importantly, he'd done it at the moment when the company's survival depended on expertise, not ego. Over the next 3 days, I watched Jake's team stumble through what could generously be called a crisis response plan. It was like watching someone try to perform surgery with a butter knife. Technically, they were making incisions, but the patient was definitely going to die. Jake's first move was to call an emergency meeting with all department heads, during which he announced that Amanda would be leading a crisis response task force to identify alternative suppliers. The plan, such as it was, involved using online supplier databases to find domestic manufacturers who could replicate our overseas partners' products within our timeline. Anyone with actual supply chain experience could have told them why this wouldn't work, but Jake wasn't asking for input from people with experience. He was asking for solutions from people who agreed with him, which turned out to be a very different thing. Amanda's task force spent 2 entire days calling potential suppliers from lists generated by their new AI-powered sourcing platform. I listened from my cubicle as they made call after call, each conversation following the same pattern: enthusiastic introduction, explanation of requirements, long pause, stammered questions about timeline and volume, followed by polite but firm refusals. The fundamental problem was one that any experienced logistics coordinator could have identified immediately. Domestic manufacturers capable of producing industrial-grade pumps and hydraulic components don't just have spare capacity sitting around waiting for emergency orders. These are specialized facilities with full production schedules, long-term contracts, and supply chains of their own that require months of lead time. But Jake's team kept trying the same approach, convinced that the next phone call would somehow yield different results. They started offering premium pricing first, 20% above standard rates, then 50%, then double. Still no takers. The few manufacturers who could theoretically handle the work explained that even with unlimited budget, they'd need 16 to 20 weeks minimum to retool their facilities and source the necessary materials. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. We had 44 days left, then 43, then 42. Each passing day brought us closer to contractual breach and financial catastrophe. Jake's second strategy was even more desperate. He authorized Amanda to reach out to international brokers, middlemen, who claimed they could source products from alternative overseas suppliers. These calls were painful to overhear because the brokers were clearly taking advantage of our desperation, quoting prices that were 3 times our usual costs for products that might or might not meet our specifications, with delivery times that were estimated and subject to change. Amanda, to her credit, seemed to recognize that these brokers were essentially offering to sell us very expensive lottery tickets. But Jake was getting pressure from above, and pressure makes people do stupid things. By Thursday afternoon, he'd authorized $2 million in deposits to 3 different brokers, essentially gambling that at least one of them would come through. I knew they wouldn't. I'd seen these operators before, in Afghanistan and in civilian logistics. They were the kind of people who showed up after disasters, promising miracle solutions, collecting deposits from desperate clients, then disappearing when reality inevitably failed to match their promises. But what bothered me most wasn't Jake's poor decision-making. It was watching him actively ignore the resources he had available. During one particularly frustrating team meeting, Tom Rodriguez suggested reaching out to his contacts at veteran-owned logistics companies, mentioning that military suppliers often had unique capabilities and flexibility. Jake dismissed the suggestion without consideration, saying they needed enterprise-level solutions, not mom-and-pop operations. I wanted to scream. Some of the most innovative and capable logistics operations I'd ever encountered were veteran-owned businesses that specialized in solving exactly these kinds of problems. They understood how to work with unconventional suppliers, how to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and how to deliver results under impossible timelines. But Jake's worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that mom-and-pop operations might outperform his preferred enterprise vendors. By Friday evening, Jake's failed contingency plan was spread across 3 whiteboards in the conference room, a maze of crossed-out supplier names, cancelled orders, and increasingly desperate backup options. The team had worked late every night that week, and their exhaustion was showing. Amanda looked particularly defeated, probably realizing that her first major assignment was turning into a career-defining failure. Jake called another emergency meeting for Monday morning, telling everyone to come prepared with creative solutions and outside-the-box thinking. But I could see in his eyes that he was running out of ideas. The confident, dismissive manager who'd laughed at my offer to help was being replaced by someone who was starting to understand that business school case studies hadn't prepared him for this kind of real-world crisis. That weekend, I found myself thinking about similar situations in Afghanistan, times when conventional approaches had failed, when standard operating procedures weren't sufficient, when survival depended on creativity, relationships, and the willingness to try solutions that looked impossible on paper. I also thought about Jake's comment, "This isn't Afghanistan, Marcus." He was right, but not in the way he meant. Afghanistan was actually harder. In Afghanistan, failure meant people died. Here, failure just meant a company went out of business and people lost their jobs. The stakes were lower, which should have made creative solutions easier, not harder. But Jake's team was trapped by their own assumptions about how business was supposed to work. They could only see solutions that fit their templates, that followed their processes, that aligned with their expectations. They couldn't see alternatives because they'd never been forced to develop the kind of flexible thinking that comes from operating in environments where your first plan, second plan, and third plan all get destroyed by circumstances beyond your control. As I sat in my apartment that Sunday evening, looking at the stack of contact information I'd accumulated over 20 years of military service and 15 years in civilian logistics, I made a decision that would change everything. Sitting in my apartment that Sunday night, staring at the Peterson Tech crisis, I couldn't help but remember another impossible supply situation from 15 years ago. The parallels were eerie, and the memory came flooding back with crystal clarity. It was March 2009, my second tour in Afghanistan. Our forward operating base, Camp Blackstone, was situated in a valley that had become increasingly hostile. The main supply route, a winding mountain road that connected us to the larger base at Bagram, had been hit by IEDs 3 times. In 2 weeks, intel suggested that insurgents were planning a coordinated attack to cut us off completely, leaving 800 soldiers stranded with rapidly dwindling supplies. My field journal from that time tells the story better than my memory ever could. I still have it, leather-bound and filled with diagrams, contact lists, and detailed notes about every supply run, every contact, every lesson learned under fire. The entry from March 15th captures the moment when conventional thinking nearly got us all killed. Major Williams called an emergency meeting today. Standard resupply convoy scheduled for tomorrow has been cancelled indefinitely. Road to dangerous, command says. Alternative is helicopter drops, but we're talking about a 70% cost increase and half the capacity. Williams is ready to authorize it because we have to work within established parameters. I remember that meeting vividly. Major Williams was a good officer, but he was thinking like a peacetime logistics coordinator. He saw 2 options, the dangerous road or expensive helicopters. When I suggested a third option, he looked at me like I'd proposed violating the laws of physics. What if we don't use the road or the helicopters? I'd asked, what if we build our own supply network? The idea was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Instead of relying on large, predictable convoys that insurgents could easily target, we'd use multiple small deliveries through routes that didn't officially exist. Local villagers had been moving goods through these mountains for centuries using paths that weren't on any military maps. If we could tap into those networks, we could maintain supplies while actually improving security. Williams was skeptical, and I didn't blame him. What I was proposing meant working with local contractors who had no security clearances, using routes that weren't approved by command, and coordinating deliveries through communication channels that couldn't be monitored by our standard systems. It sounded like a recipe for disaster, but the alternative was worse. Cut off from supplies, we'd either have to abandon our position, leaving our local allies vulnerable to retaliation, or watch our combat effectiveness degrade as we ran out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. I spent 3 days building relationships with village elders, using my basic Pashto and a lot of patience to explain what we needed. These weren't formal negotiations, they were conversations over tea, discussions about family, shared stories about the challenges of providing for people who depended on you. I learned about ancient trading routes, about seasonal patterns that affected accessibility, about family networks that spanned the entire region. The breakthrough came when I met Abdul Rashid, a tribal elder whose grandson had been treated at our medical clinic. Abdul controlled access to a network of mountain paths that had been used for smuggling and legitimate trade for generations. More importantly, he understood the value of predictable, mutually beneficial relationships. Your young soldiers, he told me through a translator, they see enemies everywhere. But we see neighbors, family, people who must live together after your army leaves. We can help you, but only if you understand that our survival depends on not picking sides. That conversation taught me something that business school never could. The most effective supply chains aren't built on contracts and legal frameworks. They're built on relationships, trust, and mutual benefit. Abdul's network could move our supplies because they knew every path, every checkpoint, every person between our base and the regional distribution points. But they'd only do it if they trusted us not to compromise their safety or their neutrality. The system we developed was unlike anything in the military logistics manual. Instead of weekly convoys carrying tons of supplies, we arranged daily deliveries of smaller quantities. Instead of armored vehicles, we used civilian trucks that looked like ordinary commercial traffic. Instead of military drivers, we used local contractors who knew how to blend in with regular traffic patterns. Most importantly, instead of following predetermined routes, we created a flexible network that could adapt instantly to changing conditions. If one path became dangerous, we'd shift to alternatives. If a particular driver drew unwanted attention, we'd rotate in someone else. If insurgents started watching for patterns, we'd change our timing and methodology. The results were remarkable. Not only did we maintain full supply levels, but we actually improved delivery reliability while reducing costs by 30%. More critically, we eliminated the security risks associated with large, predictable convoys. Insurgents couldn't target what they couldn't predict or find. The Pentagon took notice. Within 6 months, a modified version of what became known as the Chen Protocol was being tested at 3 other forward operating bases. The key insight wasn't technological, it was psychological and strategic. We'd stopped thinking like a large organization trying to impose our systems on local conditions, and started thinking like locals, trying to solve practical problems using available resources. But the most important lesson wasn't about logistics. It was about leadership. Major Williams had initially resisted my unconventional approach because it didn't fit established procedures. It took a crisis to make him realize that when circumstances change dramatically, procedures that worked in the past can become liabilities in the present. Sitting in my apartment 15 years later, staring at Peterson Tech's supply chain crisis, I realized we were facing the same fundamental challenge. Jake's team was trying to solve a new problem using old methods, working within established parameters that were no longer relevant to current circumstances. Just like in Afghanistan, the solution wouldn't come from doing the same things harder or faster. It would come from building new relationships, exploring unconventional options, and leveraging resources that didn't appear on standard organizational charts. The difference was that in Afghanistan, everyone understood we were in a crisis that required creative thinking. At Peterson Tech, half the leadership still believed they could solve an extraordinary problem using ordinary methods. But I knew something they didn't. I knew exactly how to build supply networks that could deliver results under impossible time. I knew people who specialized in solving problems that seemed unsolvable. Most importantly, I knew that what looked impossible to Jake's team was actually just difficult. And difficult problems were exactly what I'd spent 20 years learning to solve. Monday morning brought a new level of desperation to Peterson Tech. Jake's emergency meeting started at 8 a.m. sharp, and I could hear the tension in voices echoing from the conference room as the leadership team grappled with their shrinking options. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the weekend conducting my own intelligence gathering operation. 15 years at a company teaches you who really knows what's going on. It's not always the people with the fanciest titles or the biggest offices. Sometimes it's the administrative assistants who process all the financial documents, the IT specialists who monitor every system, or the facilities managers who overhear conversations while maintaining conference room equipment. My first stop was Carol Martinez in accounting. Carol had been with Peterson Tech for 12 years, and she processed every purchase order, every invoice, every financial commitment the company made. More importantly, she liked me because I'd helped her son connect with military recruiters when he was considering enlisting after high school. "Marcus," she said quietly when I stopped by her desk, "I'm really worried about what's happening. Jake's team has committed almost $4 million to these broker arrangements, but the paperwork doesn't look right. These aren't purchase orders with normal terms and conditions. They're more like gambling agreements." She showed me copies of the contracts Jake had authorized. Reading through the fine print, I realized the situation was even worse than I suspected. The brokers had cleverly structured their agreements to minimize their own risk while maximizing Peterson Tech's exposure. If they failed to deliver, which seemed increasingly likely, we wouldn't just lose our deposits. We'd be liable for additional sourcing fees and expedited processing charges that could double our losses. My next conversation was with Danny Kim in it. Danny maintained our communication systems and had access to email logs, phone records, and data usage patterns. He was also a Navy veteran who'd served on a destroyer in the Persian Gulf, so we had an instant connection that transcended company politics. "The thing is," Danny explained while pretending to troubleshoot my computer, "I can see all the external communications from Jake's team. They're making dozens of calls to the same types of suppliers, asking for the same impossible deliveries. Word is getting around the industry that Peterson Tech is desperate, and that's driving up prices for everyone, willing to even talk to us." He pulled up a network analysis showing communication patterns over the past week. Jake's team had contacted 147 different suppliers, but the conversation logs showed a depressing pattern: initial interest, detailed requirements, discussion, then polite refusal. The few positive responses came from brokers and intermediaries who specialized in taking advantage of desperate companies. "But here's the interesting part," Danny continued, lowering his voice. "I also monitor our vendor management system, and there are supply chain connections that Jake's team hasn't even considered. Companies we used to work with, relationships that went dormant when we shifted to overseas manufacturing, veterans' business networks that never got fully utilized. That information was gold." Danny's access to our historical vendor data revealed relationship patterns that went back to the company's founding. Many of these connections had been maintained on paper but ignored in practice as Peterson Tech pursued cheaper overseas alternatives. Now, ironically, those expensive domestic relationships might be our only viable options. My third intelligence source was Maria Santos, the facilities manager who'd been with the company since its early days. Maria knew everyone, heard everything, and had a remarkable ability to be invisible during important conversations. She also remembered when the company culture valued experience over youth, and she'd watched the gradual marginalization of older employees with growing concern. "They're panicking up there," she told me while we both got coffee from the break room. "Jake's been on conference calls with the board every day, and it's not going well. I heard him tell someone that they might Need to consider workforce restructuring if the queue for crisis can't be resolved. Workforce restructuring, corporate speak for mass layoffs. Jake's strategy for dealing with failure was apparently to blame it on having too many employees, rather than acknowledging that he'd dismissed the expertise that could have prevented the crisis in the first place. But Maria had more useful intelligence. The board meeting is scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Emergency session. Jake's supposed to present his final recovery plan, but from what I've overheard, he doesn't really have one. Amanda's been working 18-hour days, but she looks defeated. Tom Rodriguez tried to make suggestions during Friday's team meeting, but Jake shut him down again. Tom Rodriguez. I'd been thinking about him since Jake dismissed his suggestion about veteran-owned logistics companies. Tom was 52, a former Air Force logistics specialist who'd joined Peterson Tech 8 years ago. He'd been marginalized just like me, but he still had contacts throughout the military supply network. If anyone could help me understand the current capabilities of veteran-owned logistics companies, it would be Tom. I found him in his cubicle, another space optimization victim, staring at a spreadsheet that probably contained more bad news about delivery timelines. When he saw me approaching, his expression brightened slightly. Misery loves company, but so does experience. Marcus, he said, keeping his voice low, this whole situation is insane. I know at least 5 companies that could help us, but Jake won't even let me make the calls. Tell me about them, I said, pulling up a chair. For the next 20 minutes, Tom outlined a network of veteran-owned logistics companies that I'd heard about but never worked with directly. These weren't large corporations with fancy marketing materials. They were specialized operations run by former military logistics specialists who'd built businesses around solving exactly the kinds of problems that stumped traditional suppliers. There's Rodriguez Logistics, no relation, different Rodriguez, run by a former Army quartermaster who specializes in emergency sourcing. He's got relationships with manufacturers that most people don't even know exist. Then there's Pacific Veterans Supply, started by a Marine Corps logistics officer who spent 3 tours in Iraq. They focus on rapid deployment solutions for industrial clients. Tom's list included 12 companies, each with specific capabilities that could potentially address different aspects of our crisis. More importantly, these were people who understood urgency, who were comfortable operating under tight timelines, and who had experience building supply solutions from scratch when conventional approaches failed. The thing is, Tom continued, these companies don't work like normal suppliers. They don't have sales teams or marketing departments. They work through relationships and referrals. You can't just call them up and place an order. You need someone they trust to vouch for you. That was the key insight I'd been looking for. Jake's team was trying to solve our crisis using normal procurement processes, calling suppliers from databases and making formal requests through official channels. But emergency logistics didn't work that way. It worked through networks of personal relationships built on shared experience and mutual trust. As I walked back to my cubicle, I realized that I wasn't just observing Peterson Tech's crisis anymore. I was conducting reconnaissance for my own operation. The question wasn't whether I could help solve the company's supply chain problem. I was increasingly confident that I could. The question was whether I should buy Tuesday afternoon. The crisis timeline had become impossible to ignore. Jake had posted a company-wide memo outlining the challenges we were facing, corporate speak for we're probably doomed, and scheduled mandatory department meetings to ensure everyone understands the current operational environment. The memo was a masterpiece of executive doublespeak, full of phrases like navigating unprecedented market conditions and leveraging innovative solutions to optimize outcomes. But buried in the corporate jargon was a timeline that made my blood run cold. Peterson Tech had exactly 72 hours to secure alternative suppliers or face catastrophic contract breaches. 72 hours. In military terms, that's not even enough time for a proper planning cycle, let alone execution. Jake's team had spent 2 weeks pursuing conventional approaches, and now they were down to 3 days to find a miracle. I spent Tuesday evening at my kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks, contact lists, and supply chain diagrams. Not because I'd decided to help. I was still wrestling with that decision, but because the logistics coordinator in me couldn't stop analyzing the problem. It was like watching a puzzle with obvious solutions that nobody wanted to see. The breakthrough came when I mapped out Peterson Tech's actual requirements against the capabilities I knew existed in the veteran business network. Our crisis wasn't really about finding suppliers who could manufacture industrial pumps and hydraulic components. It was about finding suppliers who could deliver those products within our timeline, using existing inventory and rapid deployment capabilities. Most traditional manufacturers thought in terms of production cycles, order materials, schedule manufacturing, complete quality control, then ship. That process took months, which is why Jake's team kept getting rejected. But military logistics specialists thought differently. They thought in terms of asset location, rapid movement, and alternative sourcing strategies. The veteran-owned companies Tom had mentioned weren't primarily manufacturers. They were supply chain solution providers who specialized in finding and moving existing inventory when time was more important than cost. They maintained relationships with manufacturers who had surplus capacity, distributors with overstock situations, and international suppliers who could expedite shipping for the right price. More importantly, they understood how to coordinate complex multi-source operations under extreme time pressure. Instead of placing single large orders with individual suppliers, they could orchestrate dozens of smaller deliveries from multiple sources, managing the logistics to ensure everything arrived when and where it needed to be. I had seen this approach work in Afghanistan, where we regularly sourced critical supplies from networks that spanned 3 continents and delivered them to forward operating bases within days of identification. The same principles could work for Peterson Tech, but only if someone who understood those principles was coordinating the effort. Wednesday morning brought the final push from Jake's team. Amanda had compiled what she called a comprehensive alternative sourcing strategy, which turned out to be a desperate attempt to piece together partial deliveries from 7 different suppliers, none of whom could guarantee delivery timelines. I watched from my cubicle as Jake presented Amanda's plan to the senior management team. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see him gesturing at charts and timelines that looked impressive but were built on assumptions that wouldn't survive contact with reality. The plan required perfect coordination between suppliers who'd never worked together, shipping companies operating at maximum capacity, and customs processing that assumed no delays or complications. It was exactly the kind of plan that looks good in PowerPoint, but falls apart immediately upon implementation. I had seen similar plans in the military, elaborate operations that required everything to go perfectly, designed by people who'd never experienced how quickly perfect plans became disasters when reality intervened. But what really bothered me wasn't the plan's obvious flaws. It was watching Jake present it with apparent confidence to executives who didn't have enough logistics experience to recognize those flaws. They were going to approve this plan because it was the only option they'd been presented, not because it had any realistic chance of success. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't watch Peterson Tech destroy itself pursuing solutions that were doomed to fail while ignoring approaches that could actually work. More importantly, I couldn't watch 200 people lose their jobs because their leadership was too proud or too narrow-minded to consider alternatives that didn't fit their preconceptions. The moral calculation was complex. Jake had spent 2 years systematically marginalizing me and other experienced employees. He'd dismissed my expertise, questioned my value, and created a work environment where age was treated as a liability. Part of me wanted to let him fail, to watch his arrogance lead to consequences that would validate everything I'd tried to tell him. But there were other people to consider. Carol, in accounting, who'd been loyally processing Jake's questionable financial commitments while worrying about the company's future. Danny, in it, whose technical expertise was keeping our systems running while management made increasingly desperate decisions. Tom Rodriguez, whose insights about veteran suppliers could have prevented this crisis if anyone had listened to him. And there were the clients to think about. Construction companies that depended on our equipment deliveries to complete their own projects. Workers whose jobs depended on those projects staying on schedule. The ripple effects of Peterson Tech's failure would extend far beyond our office walls. Most importantly, there was the principle involved. Good logistics coordination could solve this crisis, but only if it was implemented by someone who understood how to build supply networks under extreme pressure. Jake's team was failing not because the problem was unsolvable, but because they were applying the wrong expertise to solve it. I pulled out my personal contact directory and started making phone calls. The first call was to Tom Rodriguez. Tom, it's Marcus. I need to ask you a favor. Are you willing to make some introductions to those veteran logistics companies you mentioned? The second call was to Rodriguez Logistics in San Diego. My name is Marcus Chen. I'm a former Marine Corps logistics coordinator, and I'm calling about an emergency supply chain situation. Tom Rodriguez suggested you might be able to help. The third call was to Pacific Veterans Supply in Portland, then to Mountain West Industrial Solutions in Denver, then to 3 more companies whose names Tom had given me by Thursday morning. I had a network of 12 veteran-owned logistics companies prepared to coordinate the most complex supply chain operation any of them had ever attempted. The plan we developed over a series of conference calls was audacious, unconventional, and probably impossible according to traditional business thinking. It was also our only realistic chance of saving Peterson Tech from catastrophe. Thursday evening, while Jake's team prepared for their emergency board presentation, I was 40 miles away in a coffee shop in Riverside, meeting with Maria Rodriguez, no relation to Tom, who ran Rodriguez Logistics from a converted warehouse that looked nothing like a traditional corporate office. Maria was a former Army quartermaster who'd spent 2 tours in Iraq, managing supply lines for forward operating bases. She was also one of the most innovative logistics coordinators I'd ever encountered, with a network of contacts that spanned military contractors, surplus equipment dealers, and industrial manufacturers across the western United States. The way you've described Peterson Tech's situation, she said, reviewing the notes I'd provided. This isn't really a supply problem. It's a time and coordination problem. The products you need exist. They're just distributed across multiple sources that don't normally work together. She spread out a hand-drawn map on the coffee shop table, marking locations where she'd already identified potential inventory sources. Pacific Veterans Supply has located surplus hydraulic components at a closed military facility in Nevada. Mountain West Industrial has relationships with 3 manufacturers in Colorado who have overstock situations. There's a distributor in Arizona who's been trying to move inventory that's been sitting in their warehouse for 8 months. This was exactly the kind of creative sourcing I'd hoped for, but the logistical complexity was staggering. We were talking about coordinating deliveries from 9 different sources across 6 states, with each shipment requiring different transportation methods and delivery schedules. The key, Maria continued, is treating this like a military operation instead of a business transaction. In Iraq, we regularly assembled supply missions from whatever resources were available, wherever we could find them. The difference is that military logistics prioritizes mission success over profit margins. That phrase hit me like a revelation. Military logistics prioritized mission success over profit margins. Jake's team had been trying to solve our crisis. while maintaining normal business practices, normal profit expectations, and normal risk management approaches. But crisis logistics required accepting higher costs, unusual arrangements, and unconventional methods in service of a single overriding objective: mission completion. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" I asked. Maria pulled out a detailed schedule she'd been working on during our phone conversations. "If we coordinate properly, we can have the first deliveries arriving at Peterson Tech within 96 hours. The complete order fulfilled within 12 days, but it requires perfect execution and no bureaucratic delays." 96 hours. Jake's team had spent 2 weeks searching for solutions, and Maria had found a way to start delivering results in 4 days. The difference wasn't access to better suppliers or more advanced technology. The difference was approaching the problem with military logistics thinking instead of corporate procurement thinking. "What about costs?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Higher than normal, but not catastrophic," Maria replied. "We're talking about a 40% premium over your standard overseas pricing, which is still significantly less than the penalty clauses you're facing if you can't deliver. 40% premium versus 200% penalty costs. From a purely financial perspective, this was an obvious decision, but I knew that Jake's team would focus on the premium rather than the alternative, because they'd been trained to think in terms of optimizing costs rather than avoiding catastrophic failures. My next meeting was with David Chen, again, number relation, who ran Pacific Veterans Supply from a facility near Portland International Airport. David was a former Marine Corps logistics officer who'd developed expertise in rapid deployment logistics during 3 tours in Afghanistan. His company specialized in emergency sourcing for industrial clients who needed products delivered faster than normal supply chains could handle. "The interesting thing about your situation," David explained over dinner at a restaurant near his facility, "is that Peterson Tech actually has leverage you don't realize. The products you need aren't exotic or highly specialized. They're standard, industrial components that exist in surplus quantities throughout the supply network. The problem is that normal procurement processes can't access those surplus quantities quickly enough." David's approach was to treat surplus inventory like intelligence assets, resources that existed but weren't publicly advertised or easily discoverable through conventional search methods. His network included former military procurement specialists who'd transitioned to civilian supply chain roles, maintaining informal connections that could be activated for emergency situations. "For example," he said, showing me photos on his phone, "there's a construction equipment distributor in Phoenix who ordered 200 units of hydraulic components for a project that got cancelled. They've been sitting in climate-controlled storage for 6 months while the distributor tries to find buyers. Normal market channels aren't moving them because they're priced for retail sale, but they'd be perfect for your requirements at wholesale pricing." This was the kind of opportunity that traditional procurement would never discover, because it required understanding not just what suppliers had available, but what they needed to accomplish their own business objectives. The Phoenix distributor didn't need maximum profit from those hydraulic components. They needed to recover warehouse space and recoup their investment so they could take on new projects. Over the next 2 hours, David outlined similar opportunities across the western United States: surplus inventory that needed to move, overstock situations that suppliers wanted to resolve, and production capacity that could be redirected for the right price and timeline. "The logistics coordination is complex," he admitted, "but it's exactly the kind of challenge that military supply networks handled routinely. The difference is that in civilian business, people expect simple solutions: one supplier, one delivery, one invoice. But emergency logistics requires accepting complexity in exchange for speed and reliability." By Friday morning, I had commitments from 8 veteran-owned logistics companies to coordinate what we called Operation Supply Bridge, a comprehensive emergency sourcing mission designed to fulfill Peterson Tech's Q4 requirements using unconventional methods and accelerated timelines. The operation plan was written on my personal laptop during late-night planning sessions, formatted like the military operations orders I'd written in Afghanistan. It included detailed contingency plans for transportation delays, supplier complications, and quality control challenges. Most importantly, it included backup options for every critical component, ensuring that single-point failures couldn't compromise the entire mission. But I still hadn't told anyone at Peterson Tech what I was doing. Part of me wanted to wait until Jake's board presentation failed, then step forward with a complete solution that would demonstrate the value of experience over theory. But the larger part of me, the part trained to prioritize mission success over personal satisfaction, knew that timing was critical. If I waited too long to implement Operation Supply Bridge, even the best logistics coordination wouldn't be able to overcome the mathematical realities of shipping timelines and delivery schedules. Jake's emergency board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. Friday afternoon. By 1:30, I'd made my decision about how to handle the intervention. At 1:45 p.m. on Friday afternoon, I walked to the executive conference room where Peterson Tech's board of directors was assembled for what everyone understood might be the company's final crisis meeting. Through the glass walls, I could see Jake setting up his presentation materials, while Amanda arranged printed copies of their comprehensive recovery strategy around the table. Board chairman Marcus Chen, no relation to me, despite the shared surname, was reviewing financial projections on his tablet, while 2 other board members whispered urgently about liability, exposure, and bankruptcy proceedings. The atmosphere in that room was the corporate equivalent of a military command post preparing for a desperate last stand. I knocked on the conference room door. Jake looked up with obvious irritation. "Marcus, we're about to start an emergency board meeting. Whatever you need can wait." "Actually," I said, stepping into the room, "I think what I have to offer might be relevant to your discussion." Marcus Chen looked up from his tablet. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Marcus Chen, Senior Logistics Coordinator. I've been with Peterson Tech for 15 years. I looked directly at Jake. "I'm also the person who offered to help with our supply chain crisis on Monday morning." Jake's face flushed. "Marcus, this really isn't the time or place for let him speak," Marcus Chen interrupted. "At this point, I'm interested in hearing from anyone who might have solutions." I pulled out a manila folder containing the supply chain map I'd been working on all week, a hand-drawn diagram showing alternative sourcing routes, supplier locations, and delivery timelines that looked nothing like the polished PowerPoint presentations the board was accustomed to seeing. "Before you review Mr. Morrison's recovery plan," I said, spreading my diagram on the conference table, "I'd like you to consider an alternative approach." The room went silent. Board members leaned forward to examine my unconventional presentation materials, while Jake stared at me with an expression that mixed disbelief with rising panic. "What you're looking at," I continued, "is a comprehensive supply chain solution that can begin delivering products to Peterson Tech within 96 hours and complete our Q4 obligations within 12 days. "That's impossible," Amanda said immediately. "We've contacted every viable supplier in North America. The shortest timeline anyone can offer is 16 weeks minimum." "You've contacted every traditional supplier," I corrected. "But traditional suppliers aren't the only option when you're dealing with emergency logistics." I began explaining Operation Supply Bridge, using my hand-drawn map to show how surplus inventory from 9 different sources could be coordinated to fulfill Peterson Tech's requirements. I outlined the network of veteran-owned logistics companies that had committed to the operation, their specialized capabilities, and their track record of delivering results under impossible timelines. Board member, Patricia Williams, a former Fortune 500 executive, studied my diagram with obvious interest. Mr. Chen, this approach seems remarkably complex. How can you be confident that coordinating deliveries from so many different sources won't create more problems than it solves? Because I've done this before, I replied. In Afghanistan, coordinating multi-source supply operations under extreme pressure was a standard requirement. The principles are the same whether you're supplying forward operating bases or fulfilling industrial equipment contracts. Jake finally found his voice. This is ridiculous. Marcus is talking about some kind of military fantasy that has nothing to do with modern business operations. We need real solutions, not war stories. Jake, Robert Chen said quietly, let's hear the details. For the next 20 minutes, I walked the board through Operation Supply Bridge, step by step. I explained how Maria Rodriguez had identified surplus hydraulic components in Nevada, how David Chen's network could expedite shipping from multiple West Coast suppliers, and how the entire operation would be coordinated using military-style logistics management to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. Showed them cost projections that came in 40% above normal pricing, but well below the penalty clauses. We'd face 4 contract breaches. I outlined quality control procedures that would ensure all delivered products met Peterson Tech specifications. Most importantly, I provided detailed contingency plans for every potential failure point, demonstrating that the operation had been designed with military-level redundancy and risk management. The key advantage, I explained, is that this approach treats time as more valuable than cost efficiency. Traditional procurement prioritizes finding the cheapest supplier, then fitting delivery timelines around their production schedules. Emergency logistics reverses that priority. We find suppliers who can meet our timeline requirements, then optimize costs within those constraints. Patricia Williams was taking detailed notes. Mr. Chen, you mentioned commitments from veteran-owned logistics companies. What exactly have they agreed to provide? I pulled out my contact directory and began reading names, capabilities, and specific commitments. Rodriguez Logistics would coordinate surplus component sourcing across the Southwest. Pacific Veterans Supply would handle expedited shipping from Northwest suppliers. Mountain West Industrial Solutions would manage quality control and delivery scheduling for the entire operation. These aren't theoretical commitments, I emphasized. I've spent the week building actual relationships with actual companies who have actual capabilities to fulfill our requirements. This isn't a plan, it's an operation ready for implementation. The room was completely silent for almost a minute while board members reviewed my materials and absorbed what I'd presented. Jake looked increasingly desperate, probably realizing that his carefully prepared presentation was about to be overshadowed by a hand-drawn diagram from someone he'd spent 2 years trying to marginalize. Robert Chen finally spoke. Mr. Chen, why didn't you present this solution earlier in the week? It was a fair question, and I'd been preparing for it, because Mr. Morrison made it clear that my input wasn't wanted or valued. When I offered to help on Monday morning, I was told that this crisis required sophisticated solutions and modern business approaches, not contributions from someone like me. I looked directly at Jake. I spent this week building Operation Supply Bridge on my own time, using my own contacts, because I couldn't watch Peterson Tech fail when I knew the crisis was solvable. Patricia Williams closed her notebook. Mr. Morrison, I'd like to hear your presentation now. Then I think this board needs to make some decisions about how we proceed. Jake's presentation was exactly what I'd expected, a desperate attempt to piece together partial solutions from suppliers who couldn't guarantee delivery timelines. His financial projections were optimistic to the point of fantasy, and his risk management consisted mainly of hoping that nothing would go wrong. When he finished, Robert Chen asked the question that Jake had been dreading. Mr. Morrison, what's your confidence level that this plan will actually work? Jake hesitated just long enough to reveal his own doubts. I believe we have a reasonable chance of success if all the pieces come together as projected. And Mr. Chen, Robert Chen, continued, what's your confidence level in Operation Supply Bridge? High confidence for initial deliveries within 96 hours, I replied. Moderate confidence for completing the entire operation within 12 days, assuming normal transportation and customs processing. But even if we encounter complications, we have multiple backup options that should allow us to fulfill our obligations before penalty clauses take effect. The board retired for private discussion, leaving Jake, Amanda, and me sitting in uncomfortable silence in the conference room. After 30 minutes, they returned with a decision that would change everything. Robert Chen returned to the conference room with an expression that gave nothing away. Patricia Williams and the third board member, David Park, followed close behind, their faces equally unreadable. The 30 minutes they'd spent in private discussion felt like hours, and I could see sweat beading on Jake's forehead despite the air conditioning. After careful consideration, Robert Chen began. This board has decided to authorize immediate implementation of Operation Supply Bridge under the direct supervision of Marcus Chen. The words hung in the air for a moment before their full impact registered. Jake's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, then something approaching panic as he realized what the board's decision meant for his position and credibility. However, Robert Chen continued, we're not abandoning Mr. Morrison's approach entirely. We're implementing both plans simultaneously, treating this as a dual-track strategy, where success in either operation will be sufficient to meet our obligations. It was a diplomatic solution that protected everyone's dignity while maximizing our chances of success. Jake could still pursue his conventional supplier network, while I would coordinate the veteran logistics operation. Whichever approach delivered results first would save the company. But I knew something the board didn't yet understand. Operation Supply Bridge wasn't just an alternative to Jake's plan. It was designed to begin producing results so quickly that his approach would become irrelevant before it had time to succeed or fail. Mr. Chen, Patricia Williams said, the board is authorizing up to $6 million for your operation, with expenditure approval delegated to you for any individual transaction under $500,000. Larger expenditures require board pre-approval. But given our timeline constraints, we're prepared to authorize those decisions within 4 hours of request. $6 million. Discretionary authority up to $500,000 per transaction. In one afternoon, I'd gone from marginalized employee to having more operational authority than some vice presidents. The irony wasn't lost on me, but this wasn't the time for personal satisfaction. This was the time for execution. I'll need a few things to implement the operation effectively, I said. First, direct communication authority with all department heads to coordinate internal logistics. Second, access to our vendor management system to process new supplier relationships. Third, a dedicated workspace where my team can coordinate activities without disruption. Done, Robert Chen replied immediately. Mr. Morrison, please ensure that Mr. Chen has whatever resources he needs. This is now our primary crisis response operation. Jake nodded mechanically, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was probably calculating how to position himself if Operation Supply Bridge succeeded, or how to blame its failure on insufficient support from his team. There's one more thing, I added. I'll need Tom Rodriguez assigned to my operation full-time. His knowledge of veteran supplier networks is essential for coordination, and his logistics experience will be valuable for quality control oversight. Patricia Williams made a note. Mr. Rodriguez is hereby reassigned to Operation Supply Bridge for the duration of the crisis. Are there any other personnel requirements? Danny Kim from IT4 Communication Systems Management, Carol Martinez from Accounting for expedited financial processing, and I'd like Maria Santos to coordinate our internal logistics, since she understands our facility capabilities better than anyone. I was assembling my own team from the people who actually understood how Peterson Tech operated, rather than the people who held impressive titles. More importantly, I was choosing people who'd been marginalized by Jake's management style. People who understood the value of experience and would be motivated to prove what they could accomplish when their expertise was actually valued. "Consider it done," Robert Chen said. "Mr. Chen, when can you begin implementation?" "We began 3 days ago," I replied. "I've been coordinating with supplier networks all week. The first delivery trucks should arrive at our facility Monday morning." The silence that followed was profound. Even Patricia Williams, who'd spent decades in corporate management, looked stunned by the revelation that I'd been implementing a solution while everyone else was still debating options. Jake found his voice first. "You've been conducting unauthorized negotiations with outside suppliers, using company resources for operations that weren't approved by management. I've been using my personal time and my personal relationships to develop solutions for Peterson Tech's crisis," I corrected. "No company resources were utilized, and no financial commitments were made pending board approval. But the groundwork has been laid for immediate implementation." Robert Chen leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the meeting began, I saw what might have been a smile. "Mr. Chen, how long have you been planning this operation?" "Since Monday morning, when I realized that traditional approaches weren't going to work within our timeline constraints. Military logistics training teaches you to begin developing contingency plans the moment you identify potential problems, not after those problems become crises. And you developed this entire network in 4 days?" "No, sir. I spent 20 years building relationships with people who specialize in solving impossible logistics problems. This week, I just activated those relationships for Peterson Tech's benefit." That was the moment when the room's dynamic shifted completely. Board members who'd been politely skeptical began asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, cost structures, and risk management protocols. Jake and Amanda, meanwhile, looked increasingly irrelevant to conversations about the company's survival. "Mr. Chen," David Park said, "assuming Operation Supply Bridge succeeds, what lessons should Peterson Tech learn from this experience?" It was a loaded question, and everyone in the room understood its implications. Park was asking me to evaluate the management decisions that had created our crisis in the first place. "The primary lesson," I replied carefully, "is that experience and institutional knowledge are strategic assets that should be leveraged, not marginalized. This crisis was solvable from the beginning, but only if leadership had been willing to consider unconventional approaches from people with relevant expertise." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. What could he say? That he'd been right to dismiss my offer to help? That Amanda's task force had been more effective than my veteran logistics network? That traditional business school approaches were superior to military logistics experience? Patricia Williams closed her notebook with a definitive snap. "Mr. Chen, this board expects daily progress reports on Operation Supply Bridge beginning Monday morning. We'll reconvene Tuesday afternoon to assess initial results and make any necessary adjustments to our crisis response strategy." As the board members filed out of the conference room, Robert Chen paused beside my chair. "Marcus, may I call you Marcus? I have to ask, why didn't you come to the board directly when you realized management wasn't receptive to your input?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself all week, because I've spent 15 years learning how Peterson Tech works, and I know that ideas flow upward through management channels. I assumed that if I could demonstrate value to operational leadership, that value would be recognized and leveraged appropriately. And when that didn't happen, I had to choose between letting the company fail to prove a point about management's shortcomings or implementing solutions that could save jobs and relationships that extend far beyond this office. The choice was obvious. Robert Chen nodded slowly. Marcus, I think this board needs to have some longer conversations about leadership and organizational culture. Once we've resolved our immediate crisis, would you be willing to participate in those discussions? Yes, sir. I think Peterson Tech has the potential to be much more than it currently is, but only if we're willing to have honest conversations about what's worked, what hasn't, and what needs to change. As Robert Chen left the conference room, I found myself alone with Jake and Amanda. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Jake finally spoke. I hope you understand the position you've put me in, Marcus. I understand the position Peterson Tech was in, I replied. Everything else is secondary to ensuring this company survives and our people keep their jobs. It wasn't the conversation either of us wanted to have, but it was the conversation that needed to happen. The next phase of Operation Supply Bridge would determine not just Peterson Tech's future, but the future of everyone in that room. Saturday morning at 6 a.m., I stood in Peterson Tech's main conference room, now designated as Operation Supply Bridge Command Center, watching Tom Rodriguez, Danny Kim, Carol Martinez, and Maria Santos transform the space into something that looked more like a military operations center than a corporate meeting room. We'd pushed the conference table against one wall to create space for multiple workstations. Danny had installed additional monitors and established secure communication links with our veteran supplier network. Carol had set up expedited financial processing systems that could authorize payments and transfers within hours instead of the usual week-long approval cycles. Maria had created a detailed facility map showing optimal delivery routes, staging areas, and quality control inspection zones. This feels like setting up a forward operating base, Tom observed, adjusting the large whiteboard where we'd mapped out delivery schedules and supplier coordination timelines. That's exactly what it is, I replied. We're establishing a temporary logistics hub designed to coordinate complex operations under extreme time pressure. The principles are identical whether you're supporting military operations or emergency commercial deliveries. The detailed implementation plan I'd developed with our veteran logistics partners was spread across 3 whiteboards, looking like something between a military battle plan and an air traffic control system. Each delivery was tracked by source, route, timeline, and backup options. Quality control checkpoints were marked at every stage. Communication protocols ensured that problems would be identified and addressed within hours rather than days. But the real revelation came when I began explaining the operation to my newly assembled team. As I walked them through each component of the plan, I could see their understanding of what we'd accomplished beginning to shift from impressed to amazed to something approaching awe. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Carol said, reviewing the financial projections on her laptop. You've coordinated deliveries from 9 different suppliers across 6 states, negotiated pricing that's 40% above normal but still significantly below our penalty exposure, and arranged financing terms that don't require upfront payments until after delivery confirmation. That's correct. Most of our suppliers are veteran-owned businesses that understand cash flow challenges and operational urgency. They're willing to accept payment terms that traditional suppliers would never consider. Danny looked up from his communication monitoring station. Marcus, I'm seeing coordination messages between companies that have never worked together before. How did you convince 12 different organizations to collaborate on an operation this complex? I didn't convince them to collaborate with each other, I explained. I convinced them to collaborate with me. Each company has a direct relationship with Operation Supply Bridge Command, that's us. But they don't need to coordinate directly with other suppliers. We're functioning as the central command authority that manages all interorganizational communication and coordination. Tom was studying the delivery timeline chart. This is brilliant. You've created a hub-and-spoke logistics network where each supplier only has to manage their own deliveries, but the overall operation achieves coordination that would be impossible if they all had to communicate with each other. Exactly. It's the same principle we used in Afghanistan for multi-supply operations. Central Command maintains situational awareness and coordination authority, while individual units focus on executing their specific missions. Maria Santos had been quietly reviewing the facility preparation requirements. Marcus, I have to ask, how did you know our warehouse could handle receiving deliveries from multiple suppliers simultaneously? We've never done anything like this before. Because I've been watching our operations for 15 years, I replied. I know our dock capacity, our material handling equipment, capabilities, our storage limitations, and our workforce scheduling patterns. This operation is designed around Peterson Tech's actual capabilities, not theoretical projections. That was when the full scope of what we'd accomplished began to register with everyone in the room. We weren't just implementing an emergency supply solution. We were demonstrating organizational capabilities that Peterson Tech didn't know it possessed. The thing is, I continued, this operation reveals something important about what our company could accomplish if we approach logistics strategically instead of just reactively. We've always treated supply chain management as a cost center, focused on finding the cheapest suppliers. But supply chains can be strategic assets that provide competitive advantages through flexibility, speed, and relationship management. Carol was taking detailed notes. You're talking about fundamentally changing how Peterson Tech approaches vendor relationships. I'm talking about leveraging expertise that already exists within our organization, instead of dismissing it as outdated thinking. Tom has relationships throughout the veteran business network that we've never utilized. Danny understands our communication systems better than most IT directors. You know our financial processes and cash flow patterns better than people who've been here half as long. Maria understands our physical operations better than anyone. I gestured toward the operations center we'd created. Look at what we've accomplished in 18 hours when experienced people are given authority to use their expertise effectively. This isn't magic. It's what happens when organizational knowledge is respected and leveraged instead of marginalized. Tom was nodding slowly. Marcus, I tried to suggest veteran supplier connections 6 months ago. Jake's response was that we needed enterprise-level solutions, not mom-and-pop operations. And now those mom-and-pop operations are coordinating a $6 million emergency supply operation that enterprise-level suppliers couldn't handle, I replied. The difference isn't capability, it's mindset. Veteran-owned businesses understand mission-focused thinking. They're willing to accept complex challenges and unconventional requirements because they've been trained to prioritize results over procedures. Danny had been monitoring communications from our supplier network. I'm seeing something interesting in the coordination messages. These companies are treating this operation like a military mission. They're using phrases like mission success and operational objectives instead of normal business language. That's because they understand what's at stake, I explained. This isn't just a commercial transaction for them, it's a challenge to prove that veteran logistics capabilities can compete with anyone when properly coordinated. Every company in our network knows that Operation Supply Bridge success reflects on the entire veteran business community. Carol looked up from her financial projections. Marcus, if this operation succeeds, it's going to change how everyone at Peterson Tech thinks about supply chain management, and probably how they think about experience versus innovation. If this operation succeeds, I corrected, it's going to demonstrate that innovation and experience aren't competing approaches. Real innovation comes from applying experienced judgment to new challenges, not from discarding proven methods in favor of untested theories. Maria was reviewing our facility preparation checklist. I have to admit, When I first heard about this plan, I thought you were crazy. 9 suppliers, 12 delivery schedules, multiple transportation methods. It seemed like a recipe for chaos. It would be chaos if we were trying to manage it using normal business procedures. I agreed. But we're not using normal procedures. We're using military logistics coordination methods that were designed specifically for managing complex operations under extreme pressure. That's when Tom asked the question that had been building all morning. Marcus, why haven't we been using these methods all along? Why did it take a crisis to demonstrate what's possible when we actually leverage our organizational expertise? It was a profound question that went to the heart of Peterson Tech's problems, and the answer would determine not just whether Operation Supply Bridge succeeded, but whether the company learned anything from the experience that had brought us to this point. Monday morning at 7:15 a.m., the first delivery truck from Rodriguez Logistics pulled into Peterson Tech's loading dock, exactly as scheduled. I stood watching from the warehouse office window as Maria Santos directed our receiving team through inspection procedures we'd rehearsed over the weekend, feeling the same mixture of anticipation and controlled anxiety I'd experienced before every major operation in Afghanistan. The difference was that in Afghanistan, successful logistics meant soldiers got the supplies they needed to complete their missions. Here, successful logistics meant 200 people kept their jobs and Peterson Tech survived to operate another day. The stakes were different, but the fundamental requirement was identical: flawless execution under pressure. First delivery confirmed and inspected. Maria's voice crackled through the radio headset Danny had rigged up for our command center. Hydraulic components match specifications exactly. Quality control approval granted for immediate transfer to staging area. Tom Rodriguez updated our tracking board, marking the first green checkmark on a timeline that would determine Peterson Tech's future. 1 down, 47 to go, he said, but his tone was optimistic rather than worried. Over the next 4 hours, we received deliveries from 3 more suppliers: surplus industrial pumps from Pacific Veteran Supply, specialized fittings from Mountain West Industrial Solutions, and electrical components from a veteran-owned distributor in Arizona whose name I'd gotten from a contact who'd served with me in Afghanistan. Each delivery followed the same pattern: arrival notification, inspection protocol, quality control, verification, then transfer to designated staging areas where Carol Martinez tracked financial obligations and Danny Kim updated our supplier network with confirmation messages. By 11:30 a.m., we'd received $1.8 million worth of products that Jake's team had spent 2 weeks failing to source. But the real test came when we encountered our first complication. At 1:45 p.m., Rodriguez Logistics called with a problem. Their truck, carrying critical pump assemblies, had broken down outside of Barstow, California, stranding a delivery worth $400,000 on a highway with no immediate repair options available. In a traditional corporate environment, this would have triggered emergency meetings, escalation to senior management, and probably panic about backup plans that didn't exist. In our operations center, it triggered exactly the kind of rapid problem-solving that military logistics had trained us for. Rodriguez Logistics reports mechanical failure on Highway 15. Danny announced from his communication station, ETA-2. Peterson Tech, now uncertain, pending roadside repairs. Options? I asked immediately. Tom was already working his phone. Mountain West Industrial has a delivery truck returning empty from a Phoenix run. They're 3 hours from the breakdown location and could transfer the cargo for continued delivery. Timeline impact: 6 hours delay instead of potential 2-4-4-8 hour delay for truck repairs. Cost impact? I asked Carol. $3,000 transfer fee plus fuel costs. Negligible compared to delivery delay penalties. Authorize it, I decided. Danny, coordinate the transfer. Tom, confirm backup delivery timeline with our receiving team. Carol, process the additional fees. The entire problem identification, solution development, and authorization sequence took 12 minutes. By 2 p.m., Mountain West Industrial's driver was en route to transfer cargo from the disabled Rodriguez truck, and our delivery timeline was back on track with minimal disruption. That, Maria Santos observed from her facility coordination station, is how problems should be solved. Identify, analyze, decide, implement. No committees, no extended discussions, no bureaucratic delays. But what impressed me most wasn't our problem-solving speed. It was watching my team demonstrate capabilities that Peterson Tech's normal operations had never allowed them to use. Tom Rodriguez revealed an intuitive understanding of logistics, coordination that had been wasted in his marginalized position. Danny Kim showed technical innovation skills that went far beyond routine IT support. Carol Martinez demonstrated financial analysis capabilities that had been underutilized in her routine accounting role. Most importantly, Maria Santos proved that her 15 years of facility management experience had given her insights into Peterson Tech's operational capabilities that could have been valuable for strategic planning if anyone had bothered to ask for her input. By Tuesday afternoon, we'd received deliveries from 7 of our 9 supplier sources, with the remaining 2 deliveries scheduled for Wednesday and Thursday. Our staging areas were filled with industrial equipment that would fulfill 85% of Peterson Tech's queue for obligations, and our supplier network was already coordinating the final deliveries that would complete the operation. Jake Morrison made his first appearance in our operations center Tuesday evening, ostensibly to check on progress, but clearly trying to understand how we'd accomplished in 4 days what his team hadn't managed in 2 weeks. "This is quite an impressive operation you've put together," he said, reviewing our tracking boards and coordination systems. "It's an impressive demonstration of what Peterson Tech's people can accomplish when their expertise is properly leveraged." I replied diplomatically. Jake walked around the operations center, examining our supplier communication logs, delivery schedules, and quality control procedures. I could see him trying to identify flaws or problems he could highlight, but Operation Supply Bridge had been designed with military-level redundancy and contingency planning. "Marcus," he finally said, "I have to admit that I underestimated what you could contribute to our crisis response." "Jake, you didn't underestimate my capabilities. You made assumptions about the value of experience versus innovation, and those assumptions prevented you from recognizing solutions that were available from the beginning." "I suppose you're right," he admitted reluctantly. "But surely you can understand why I was skeptical about unconventional approaches that didn't fit our normal business practices." "I understand why you were skeptical," I replied, "but I also understand that normal business practices don't work for abnormal business problems. This crisis required logistics expertise that your team didn't possess, coordination capabilities that traditional suppliers couldn't provide, and relationship networks that took 20 years to develop." Tom Rodriguez looked up from his supplier coordination station. "Jake, the thing is, this expertise was available all along. Marcus offered to help on Monday morning, but he was dismissed before he could explain what he had to offer. And I offered suggestions about veteran suppliers 6 months ago," added Carol Martinez, "but was told we needed enterprise-level solutions." Jake's expression showed that he was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Operation Supply Bridge wasn't just solving Peterson Tech's immediate crisis, it was demonstrating that his management approach had systematically undervalued the human resources that could have prevented the crisis in the first place. "Jake," I said quietly, "the question isn't whether you made mistakes in handling this situation. The question is what Peterson Tech learns from this experience about leveraging organizational expertise going forward." Wednesday morning brought the final deliveries from our supplier network, completing Operation Supply Bridge ahead of schedule and under budget. But more importantly, it brought a board meeting that would determine not just how Peterson Tech recovered from its crisis, but how the company would operate in the future. Wednesday afternoon's board meeting felt completely different from the emergency session 5 days earlier. The same people sat around the same conference table, but the atmosphere had shifted from desperate crisis management to strategic planning for Peterson Tech's future. Robert Chen opened the meeting by reviewing Operation Supply Bridge's results. 100% of queue for obligations fulfilled. Delivery timeline completed 2 days ahead of schedule. Total costs coming in 15% under budget projections, and 0 quality control issues with any received products. Mr. Chen, Patricia Williams, said, "These results are remarkable, but I'm equally interested in the operational insights this experience has provided. What has Peterson Tech learned about its own capabilities?" "We've learned that our organizational knowledge and expertise were significantly underutilized," I replied. "The people who solved this crisis aren't new hires or outside consultants. They're employees who've been with Peterson Tech for years, whose capabilities were never fully recognized or leveraged." I gestured toward Tom Rodriguez, who was attending the board meeting for the first time in his 8 years with the company. Tom's knowledge of veteran supplier networks could have prevented this crisis if anyone had listened to his suggestions. 6 months ago, Carol's financial analysis capabilities enabled rapid payment processing that traditional accounting procedures couldn't have handled. Maria's understanding of our facility operations made it possible to coordinate simultaneous deliveries that would normally overwhelm our receiving capacity. David Park was taking detailed notes. "Are you suggesting that Peterson Tech's crisis was caused by management practices that marginalized experienced employees?" It was a direct question that required a direct answer. "I'm suggesting that when organizations systematically dismiss expertise based on factors like age or unconventional backgrounds, they create vulnerabilities that eventually manifest as crises." Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been notably quiet since the meeting began, probably recognizing that any comments he made would highlight his role in creating the problems that Operation Supply Bridge had solved. "Mr. Chen," Robert Chen said, "if you were tasked with preventing similar crises in the future, what changes would you recommend to Peterson Tech's operational approach?" "First, implement systematic expertise assessment for all employees, identifying knowledge and capabilities that aren't reflected in current job descriptions. Second, establish veteran supplier relationships as a strategic asset rather than treating all vendors as interchangeable cost centers. Third, create decision-making processes that prioritize experience and institutional knowledge alongside innovation and cost optimization." Patricia Williams leaned forward. "Those recommendations sound like criticism of current management practices. They're observations about practices that created vulnerabilities this crisis exposed." I replied carefully. "The goal isn't to assign blame for past decisions, but to ensure Peterson Tech develops resilience against future challenges." But Robert Chen wasn't interested in diplomatic language. "Mr. Chen, let's be direct. Do you believe current leadership is capable of implementing the changes Peterson Tech needs?" The room went silent. Everyone understood that this question would determine not just Peterson Tech's operational future, but the career futures of everyone present. Jake's expression showed that he knew his credibility had been fundamentally undermined by the contrast between his team's failures and Operation Supply Bridge's success. "I believe Peterson Tech's leadership needs to evolve," I said finally. "The challenge isn't individual competence, it's organizational culture. We need leadership that values experience as much as innovation, that seeks input from people with relevant expertise regardless of their position in the hierarchy, and that prioritizes long-term organizational resilience over short-term cost optimization." David Park closed his notebook. "Mr. Chen, would you be willing to assume operational leadership responsibilities to implement those changes?" The question hit me like a physical impact. In 5 days, I'd gone from marginalized logistics coordinator to crisis solution provider to candidate for senior leadership. The irony was overwhelming, but so was the opportunity to demonstrate what Peterson Tech could become under different management principles. "I'd be honored to serve Peterson Tech in whatever capacity the board believes would be most valuable," I replied. "But any leadership transition should prioritize organizational success over individual advancement," Jake, Robert Chen said, turning to address the man who'd dismissed my expertise 5 days earlier. "What's your assessment of Peterson Tech's leadership requirements going forward?" Jake's response revealed his understanding that his position had become untenable. "Think the board should seriously consider Marcus's recommendations about organizational changes. Operation Supply Bridge has demonstrated capabilities and expertise that I failed to recognize or utilize effectively." It was a gracious admission that probably salvaged his professional reputation while acknowledging the reality that his management approach had nearly destroyed the company he'd been entrusted to lead. Patricia Williams made the motion that formalized what everyone in the room already understood. "I move that the board offer Marcus Chen the position of Chief Operations Officer with authority to implement organizational changes necessary to prevent future supply chain crises and leverage Peterson Tech's human resources more effectively." The motion passed unanimously. Jake Morrison submitted his resignation that afternoon, accepting a generous severance package that included positive references and a commitment that his departure would be characterized as a strategic career transition rather than crisis-related termination. Amanda Stevens was reassigned to a business development role where her analytical skills and consulting experience could be valuable without requiring the logistics expertise she'd never had opportunity to develop. But the most important change wasn't in titles or organizational charts. It was in the recognition that Peterson Tech's most valuable assets weren't its equipment or facilities or financial resources. They were the people who'd spent years accumulating expertise that had never been fully recognized or utilized. Thursday morning, I sat in the office that had been Jake's just a week earlier, looking at an organizational chart that reflected Peterson Tech's actual capabilities rather than theoretical hierarchies. Tom Rodriguez was now Senior Logistics Coordinator, with authority to develop veteran supplier relationships into competitive advantages. Carol Martinez had been promoted to Financial Operations Manager, with expanded responsibilities for strategic financial analysis. Maria Santos became Facility Operations Director, finally receiving recognition for expertise she'd been applying informally for 15 years. Most importantly, Danny Kim was promoted to Chief Information Officer with authority to implement communication and coordination systems that could support complex operations like Operation Supply Bridge on a permanent basis. These weren't charity promotions or diversity initiatives. They were strategic decisions based on demonstrated capabilities that had saved Peterson Tech from catastrophic failure. But as I sat in my new office, reviewing plans for Peterson Tech's transformation, I realized that our success had revealed something more important than individual career advancement. We'd demonstrated that organizations prosper when they leverage all available expertise, regardless of its source, and suffer when they dismiss knowledge that doesn't fit predetermined assumptions about value and relevance. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Robert Chen, calling to discuss Peterson Tech's strategic planning for the coming year and the role that veteran-owned businesses could play in our long-term competitive strategy. The transformation was just beginning. Jake Morrison's resignation letter arrived on my desk Friday morning, 2 weeks after the crisis that had changed everything at Peterson Tech. It was professional, gracious, and completely lacking in the defensiveness I'd expected from someone whose management philosophy had been so thoroughly discredited by recent events. Marcus, the letter read, I want to acknowledge that my approach to leadership at Peterson Tech failed to recognize and leverage the expertise that was available within our organization. Operation Supply Bridge succeeded because you applied knowledge and relationships that I dismissed without proper consideration. I take full responsibility for decisions that nearly cost our company its survival and our employees their livelihoods. The letter continued with recommendations for organizational changes that sounded remarkably similar to the principles I'd outlined to the board. Jake suggested implementing expertise assessment programs, developing veteran supplier relationships as strategic assets, and creating decision-making processes that valued experience alongside innovation. Most importantly, he concluded, Peterson Tech must learn to distinguish between legitimate innovation and change for its own sake. Real progress comes from building on proven foundations, not from discarding institutional knowledge in pursuit of theoretical improvements. It was a thoughtful analysis that revealed more insight than Jake had demonstrated during his entire tenure as operations director. Perhaps crisis and failure had taught him lessons that success and promotion never could. But the most significant development wasn't Jake's resignation letter. It was the board resolution that arrived the same afternoon, formally documenting Peterson Tech's new operational philosophy and my authority to implement it. The resolution established veteran-owned businesses as preferred suppliers for Peterson Tech, with procurement policies designed to leverage their specialized capabilities and operational flexibility. It created expertise assessment protocols requiring systematic evaluation of employee knowledge and capabilities that might not be reflected in formal job descriptions. Most importantly, it mandated experience integration requirements for all major operational decisions, ensuring that institutional knowledge would be considered alongside external recommendations. These weren't just policy changes, they were cultural transformations that would determine Peterson Tech's character for years to come. The company that had nearly failed because it dismissed expertise based on age and background was committing to become an organization that actively sought and valued knowledge from every available source. My first test as Chief Operations Officer came the following Monday, when Patricia Williams called with news that Peterson Tech's largest client wanted to expand their contract by 40%, adding $8 million in new business that would require supply chain coordination even more complex than Operation Supply Bridge. The client was impressed by our performance during the queue for crisis, Patricia explained. They want to know if Peterson Tech can handle emergency logistics as a regular service offering, not just a crisis response capability. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that Jake's management approach would have struggled with. Traditional procurement, thinking focused on finding single suppliers who could handle large contracts using standardized processes. But our potential client was asking for something different: ongoing access to the kind of flexible, multi-source coordination that had saved Peterson Tech from catastrophe. We can handle it, I told Patricia, but it will require expanding our veteran supplier network and developing permanent coordination capabilities rather than treating emergency logistics as a one-time operation. Over the next 3 days, I worked with Tom Rodriguez to map out a comprehensive expansion of Peterson Tech's logistics capabilities. Instead of maintaining the minimal supplier relationships that had created our vulnerability, we would develop what I called a strategic redundancy network, multiple suppliers for every critical component, with coordination protocols that could activate alternative sources within hours of identification need. The financial investment was significant: $2 million annually in retainer fees to maintain relationships with veteran logistics companies, plus upgraded communication and coordination systems that could manage complex multi-source operations on a permanent basis. But the strategic value was even more significant. Peterson Tech would become one of the few industrial equipment suppliers capable of handling emergency requirements that left our competitors helpless. "What you're proposing, Patricia Williams," observed during a strategic planning meeting, "is turning Peterson Tech's crisis response capabilities into competitive advantages." "Exactly," I replied. "Most companies treat supply chain resilience as insurance, something you hope you never need, but maintain for protection. We're treating it as a service offering that creates value for clients while protecting our own operations." The transformation wasn't limited to supplier relationships. Danny Kim's communication systems integration had revealed operational insights that were changing how Peterson Tech approached everything from inventory management to customer service. Carol Martinez's financial analysis capabilities were being applied to strategic planning instead of just routine accounting. Maria Santos's facility expertise was influencing expansion decisions that would determine Peterson Tech's capacity for years to come. Most importantly, we'd identified 12 other employees whose expertise had been underutilized by previous management approaches. Janet Wong, a 49-year-old customer service representative, turned out to have extensive knowledge of client operational requirements that could inform product development decisions. Robert Kim, a 56-year-old maintenance supervisor, had insights into equipment reliability patterns that could improve our quality control processes. By December, Peterson Tech's transformation was attracting industry attention. Trade publications were writing articles about our innovative approach to supply chain management and our strategic integration of veteran-owned suppliers. What they didn't understand was that our innovation consisted mainly of recognizing and utilizing expertise that had always existed within our organization. The final validation came when 3 competitors approached us about consulting arrangements, wanting to understand how Peterson Tech had developed such effective emergency logistics capabilities. They were offering significant fees for access to coordination methods that we'd developed, not through expensive research and development, but through the simple expedient of listening to people who'd been trying to share their knowledge for years. Jake Morrison's departure had been necessary, but it wasn't vindictive. He'd accepted responsibility for decisions that had nearly destroyed Peterson Tech, and he'd learned lessons that would probably make him a better leader in his next position. More importantly, his resignation had created opportunity for organizational changes that were benefiting everyone who remained with the company. The crisis that had started with his dismissive comment about Grandpa retiring had revealed that Peterson Tech's most valuable resource wasn't innovative thinking or cutting-edge technology. It was the accumulated wisdom of people who'd spent decades learning how to solve problems that seemed impossible until you understood the right approach to pursue. As I prepared for Peterson Tech's annual strategic planning retreat, I realized that our transformation was complete. We'd evolved from a company that dismissed expertise to one that actively sought it, from an organization that treated experience as liability to one that leveraged it as competitive advantage. But the most important change wasn't operational or financial. It was cultural. Peterson Tech had become a place where knowledge was valued, regardless of its source, where innovation built on proven foundations rather than discarding them, and where success was measured by results rather than adherence to theoretical principles. The company that had nearly failed because it couldn't recognize the value of experience had become a model for how organizations could prosper by leveraging all available expertise. Jake Morrison's ultimate legacy wasn't the crisis he'd created, but the transformation that crisis had made possible. 3 months into my role as Chief Operations Officer, I faced the most difficult decision of my civilian career. Peterson Tech's board had offered me the position of Chief Executive Officer, with Robert Chen stepping back to Chairman Emeritus and the full authority to shape the company's future according to the principles we'd established during our crisis transformation. The offer came during Peterson Tech's most successful quarter in company history. Our expanded logistics capabilities had attracted new clients who valued reliability over lowest cost sourcing. Our veteran supplier network had become a competitive advantage that competitors were struggling to replicate. Most importantly, our organizational culture had evolved into something that respected experience while encouraging innovation, creating an environment where knowledge was valued regardless of its source. But accepting the CEO position would mean committing to Peterson Tech for the long term, probably for the remainder of my career. At 68, I had maybe 7 good working years left, and I needed to decide whether to spend them building on what we'd accomplished or pursuing other opportunities that my newfound reputation had made possible. The external opportunities were tempting. 3 consulting firms had offered partnerships focused on organizational transformation and crisis logistics. 2 veteran-owned businesses had approached me about joining their leadership teams. Most intriguingly, the Pentagon had inquired about my availability for a civilian logistics coordination position that would apply lessons from Operation Supply Bridge to military supply chain modernization. Each option offered different rewards and challenges, but they all shared one characteristic: they would take me away from Peterson Tech, just as the company was demonstrating what was possible when organizations truly leveraged their human resources effectively. I spent a weekend at my apartment, surrounded by the same contact lists and operational notebooks that had enabled Operation Supply Bridge, trying to decide what would best serve both my personal goals and the broader principles I'd been advocating. The breakthrough came during a conversation with my son David, who'd called to congratulate me on Peterson Tech's recent industry recognition. Our relationship had improved dramatically since Operation Supply Bridge, partly because my professional success had helped him understand that his father's military experience represented valuable expertise rather than outdated thinking. "Dad," he said during our Saturday evening phone call, "I've been thinking about what you've accomplished at Peterson Tech, and I realize I never really understood what you did in the military or why it mattered." "It mattered because logistics coordination affects everything else," I explained. "Whether you're supplying forward operating bases or fulfilling industrial equipment contracts, success depends on getting the right resources to the right place at the right time. The principles are identical even when the applications are different." "But that's not what I mean," David continued. "I mean, I never understood that your expertise could create opportunities for other people. Mum always talked about your military service as something that took you away from family, but watching what's happened at Peterson Tech, I'm starting to see it as preparation for helping people in ways that wouldn't have been possible otherwise." That conversation crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. Operation Supply Bridge hadn't just saved Peterson Tech from crisis. It had demonstrated that expertise gained in one context could create value in completely different environments. More importantly, it had shown that individual success could enable collective success when knowledge was shared rather than hoarded. The decision became clear when I realized that accepting the CEO position wasn't just about my career advancement. It was about establishing Peterson Tech as a model for how organizations could prosper by recognizing and leveraging expertise from unconventional sources. If we could demonstrate that military experience translated to civilian business success, that age could be an asset rather than liability, and that institutional knowledge could drive innovation rather than inhibit it, other organizations might adopt similar approaches. I called Robert Chen Sunday evening to accept the CEO position, with conditions that reflected lessons learned during Peterson Tech's transformation. "I'll accept," I told him, "but only if the board commits to specific policies that institutionalize the principles that enabled our recovery. First, mandatory expertise assessment for all employees, with career development plans that leverage their full capabilities. Second, veteran hiring preferences that recognize military experience as valuable business preparation. Third, age diversity requirements that ensure experienced perspectives are represented in decision-making processes. Robert Chen's response was immediate. Marcus, those aren't conditions, they're strategic advantages that will differentiate Peterson Tech from competitors who are still thinking in terms of traditional human resource management. The formal announcement came Tuesday morning, along with Peterson Tech's new mission statement, leveraging expertise from every source to deliver solutions that exceed client expectations and create opportunities for organizational excellence. It wasn't the kind of corporate mission statement that consulting firms usually recommend to specific to, focused on internal capabilities rather than market positioning, but it accurately reflected what Peterson Tech had become, an organization that succeeded by recognizing and utilizing knowledge that other companies overlooked or dismissed. My first initiative as CEO was establishing the Peterson Tech Leadership Institute, a program designed to identify and develop expertise within our organization while sharing our approaches with other companies facing similar challenges. The Institute would offer consulting services based on our transformation experience, training programs for organizations seeking to improve their expert utilization, and research into best practices for leveraging institutional knowledge. But the Institute's most important function would be demonstrating that Peterson Tech's success wasn't accidental or unrepeatable. We'd developed systematic approaches to expertise identification, relationship building, and crisis response that could be adapted by organizations across different industries and operational environments. The program launched with partnerships from 12 veteran-owned businesses, 8 trade associations, and 3 universities interested in studying organizational transformation. More importantly, it launched with commitment from Peterson Tech's entire leadership team to share knowledge rather than protecting proprietary advantages. What we've learned, I explained during the Institute's inaugural presentation, is that organizational success comes from building on proven foundations rather than discarding them in pursuit of theoretical improvements. Innovation works best when it leverages existing expertise rather than dismissing it as outdated thinking. The presentation was attended by representatives from 43 companies, including 3 of Peterson Tech's primary competitors. Sharing our transformation methods with competitors seemed counterintuitive from traditional business perspectives, but our experience had taught us that creating industry-wide improvements in expertise utilization would benefit everyone involved in supply chain coordination. As I stood before that audience, explaining how military logistics principles had saved a civilian company from catastrophic failure, I realized that accepting the CEO position had been the right decision, not just for Peterson Tech, but for the broader goal of demonstrating what organizations could accomplish when they truly valued knowledge from every available source. The transformation that had begun with Jake Morrison's dismissive comment about Grandpa retiring had become a model for how experience and innovation could work together to create results that neither could achieve independently. Peterson Tech's future was no longer in doubt, but more importantly, we'd established principles that could help other organizations avoid the kind of crisis that had nearly destroyed us. The company that had been saved by recognizing the value of experience was now teaching others how to leverage expertise they didn't know they possessed. 6 months after becoming CEO, I stood in Peterson Tech's newly expanded facility, watching a diversity of employees that would have been impossible under Jake Morrison's management philosophy. The company culture assessment Danny Kim had compiled told a remarkable story of organizational transformation that went far beyond operational improvements. Employee satisfaction scores had increased 47% since Operation Supply Bridge, with the largest improvements among workers over 45 who'd previously felt marginalized by management decisions. Turnover rates had dropped to their lowest levels in company history, saving Peterson Tech hundreds of thousands of dollars in recruitment and training costs. Most significantly, innovative suggestions from employees had increased 340%, with many of the best ideas coming from people whose input had been systematically ignored under previous leadership. The transformation was visible throughout the facility. Tom Rodriguez now led a logistics coordination team that included 3 other veterans whose expertise had been underutilized in their previous positions. Carol Martinez managed a financial analysis department that provided strategic insights instead of just routine bookkeeping. Maria Santos directed facility operations that had been expanded to handle 60% more throughput than anyone had thought possible. But the most dramatic change was in our veteran hiring initiative. Peterson Tech now employed 42 veterans in positions ranging from logistics coordination to client relationship management, making us one of the most veteran-friendly employers in our industry. More importantly, these weren't charity hires or diversity initiatives. They were strategic decisions based on recognition that military experience translated directly to valuable civilian capabilities. The thing that surprises people, I explained to a delegation from the Department of Veterans Affairs who'd come to study our hiring practices, is that we're not accommodating veterans despite their military background. We're hiring them because of their military background. The delegation was reviewing data showing that Peterson Tech's veteran employees had promotion rates 23% higher than industry averages, retention rates that exceeded company norms, and performance evaluations that consistently ranked in the top quartiles. These weren't statistical anomalies. They reflected systematic advantages that military experience provided in civilian business environments. Military training emphasizes mission focus, adaptability, and collaborative problem-solving. I continued. Those capabilities are exactly what modern businesses need to handle complex challenges and changing operational requirements. Our success had attracted national attention. Harvard Business Review published a case study on Peterson Tech's transformation. The Wall Street Journal wrote about our innovative approach to expertise utilization. Industry publications featured articles about how military logistics principles could improve civilian supply chain management. But the recognition that meant the most came from organizations that had implemented similar approaches after studying our methods. 12 companies had adopted veteran hiring preferences based on Peterson Tech's model. 8 organizations had implemented expertise assessment programs designed to identify underutilized employee capabilities. 3 entire industries were reconsidering age diversity policies after observing our results. The ripple effects extended beyond business outcomes. My relationship with David and Lisa had improved dramatically as they witnessed their father's professional success and came to understand that his military experience represented valuable expertise rather than time away from family. David had even started exploring veteran-owned business opportunities, recognizing potential applications for skills his father had tried to teach him years earlier. Lisa called regularly now, asking for advice about her own career challenges and sharing stories about implementing leadership principles I'd learned in Afghanistan to manage her marketing team in Seattle. Our conversations revealed that military experience had given me insights into organizational dynamics that were valuable in civilian contexts, even when the specific applications were completely different. Most importantly, Peterson Tech's success had enabled me to establish the Marcus Chen Foundation for Veteran Employment, a non-profit organization that connected military veterans with civilian employers who understood the value of their expertise. The foundation provided training programs that helped veterans translate military experience into civilian business language, while educating employers about capabilities that military training developed. The Foundation's first annual conference attracted 200 employers and 500 veteran job seekers, resulting in 180 placement matches that exceeded both groups' expectations. Follow-up surveys showed that 94% of participating employers planned to increase their veteran hiring, while 97% of placed veterans reported job satisfaction that exceeded their pre-employment expectations. What we've learned, I told the conference audience, is that successful veteran employment isn't about finding jobs that veterans can do despite their military background. It's about finding positions where military experience provides competitive advantages that benefit both employee and employer. The conference presentation included case studies from Peterson Tech and 11 other companies that had successfully integrated veteran expertise into their operations. The examples spanned industries from logistics coordination to project management to crisis response, demonstrating that military skills translated broadly across civilian business environments. But the Foundation's most important function wasn't job placement. It was changing employer perceptions about the value of military experience. We were documenting systematic advantages that veteran employees provided, creating data-driven arguments for hiring decisions that had previously been based on goodwill or legal compliance rather than strategic business considerations. The cultural transformation at Peterson Tech had become a model for organizational change that extended far beyond veteran employment. We demonstrated that recognizing and leveraging underutilized expertise could create competitive advantages while improving workplace satisfaction and employee retention. Companies were sending delegations to study our Peterson Tech model of expertise utilization, implementing systematic approaches to identifying employee capabilities that weren't reflected in formal job descriptions. Trade associations were developing best practices based on our experience. Business schools were creating case studies that used Peterson Tech's transformation to teach principles of organizational development and human resource management. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jake Morrison's dismissive comment about Grandpa retiring had triggered changes that were now being studied by organizations across multiple industries. His failure to recognize available expertise had created a crisis that forced Peterson Tech to develop systematic approaches to expertise utilization that were proving valuable far beyond our specific situation. As I reviewed Peterson Tech's annual performance metrics, revenue up 67%, profit margins improved 34%, client satisfaction at all-time highs, employee turnover at historic lows, I realized that our transformation represented something larger than business success. We'd proven that organizations prosper when they value knowledge from every available source, and that innovation works best when it builds on proven foundations rather than discarding them. The company that had nearly failed because it couldn't recognize the value of experience had become a demonstration of what was possible when expertise was truly leveraged rather than marginalized. More importantly, we'd created a model that other organizations could adapt to unlock potential they didn't know they possessed. Peterson Tech's story was no longer just about one company's recovery from crisis. It was about proving that age could be an asset, that military experience translated to civilian value, and that institutional knowledge could drive innovation rather than inhibit it. The transformation that had begun with one veteran's refusal to let ignorance triumph over expertise had become a movement that was changing how organizations thought about their most valuable resource, their people. 1 year later, I sat in my CEO office looking at a framed photograph that captured everything Peterson Tech had become. The image showed our entire company gathered for our annual achievement celebration, 247 employees, representing every generation, from recent college graduates to experienced professionals in their 70s. with military veterans, civilian experts, and innovative thinkers working together in ways that would have been impossible under previous management approaches. In the center of the photograph stood the core team that had made Operation Supply Bridge possible. Tom Rodriguez, now Senior Vice President of Logistics, Carol Martinez, Chief Financial Officer, Maria Santos, Vice President of Operations, and Danny Kim, Chief Technology Officer. Around them were the faces of people whose expertise had been discovered and developed over the past year, creating opportunities that transformed individual careers, while strengthening Peterson Tech's competitive position. The numbers told a remarkable story. Peterson Tech's revenue had increased 89% since the crisis that had nearly destroyed us. Our client base had expanded from regional to national, with companies specifically seeking our services because of capabilities that didn't exist elsewhere. In our industry, employee satisfaction scores ranked in the top 5% nationally, while turnover rates remained at historic lows. Most importantly, our veteran employment program had become a model that 127 other companies had adopted, creating thousands of opportunities for military veterans who'd previously struggled to translate their expertise into civilian success. But the transformation's true measure wasn't financial or operational, it was cultural. Peterson Tech had become living proof that organizations prosper when they recognize and leverage expertise from every available source, regardless of its age, background, or conventional presentation. The lesson extended far beyond our specific industry or circumstances. In a world where technological change often prioritized novelty over wisdom, where youth was frequently valued more than experience, and where innovation was sometimes pursued at the expense of proven methods, Peterson Tech demonstrated that sustainable success required building on foundations of knowledge rather than discarding them. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Patricia Williams, calling to discuss Peterson Tech's expansion into international markets, an opportunity that had emerged because our expertise-based approach to operations had attracted attention from companies worldwide who were struggling with similar challenges. "Marcus," she said, "I have proposals from firms in Germany, Japan, and Australia who want to license the Peterson Tech model for implementation in their markets. They're offering substantial fees for access to our organizational development methods." The international interest reflected growing recognition that Peterson Tech's transformation represented more than an isolated business success story. We'd developed systematic approaches to expertise, identification, relationship building, and crisis response that could be adapted across cultures and industries, creating value that transcended specific operational circumstances. What's most interesting, Patricia continued, is that these companies aren't just seeking our logistics coordination methods. They want to understand how we changed organizational culture to value experience alongside innovation, and how we developed employee assessment systems that identify capabilities traditional hiring processes miss. After ending the call, I walked through Peterson Tech's facility, observing operations that would have been impossible to imagine 2 years earlier. Veterans worked alongside civilian professionals, combining military expertise with business knowledge to create solutions that neither group could have developed independently. Experienced employees mentored younger colleagues while learning from their technological capabilities and fresh perspectives. Most importantly, everyone understood that their knowledge was valued regardless of its source or conventional presentation. The transformation had taught me lessons about leadership that 20 years of military service and 15 years of corporate experience hadn't provided. Real organizational change required more than implementing new policies or restructuring reporting. Relationships, it required creating environments where people felt safe to share knowledge, where expertise was recognized regardless of its packaging. and where innovation built on proven foundations rather than discarding them. The crisis that had begun with Jake Morrison's dismissive comment about Grandpa retiring had revealed fundamental truths about organizational success that extended far beyond Peterson Tech's specific circumstances. Companies that systematically dismissed expertise based on age, background, or unconventional presentation created vulnerabilities that eventually manifested as performance problems or competitive disadvantages. Organizations that recognized and leveraged knowledge from every available source developed resilience and capabilities that competitors struggled to replicate. As I prepared for Peterson Tech's second annual strategic planning retreat, I realized that our story had become larger than any individual success or failure. We'd demonstrated that military experience translated to civilian value, that age could be an asset rather than liability, and that institutional knowledge could drive innovation rather than inhibit it. Most importantly, we'd proven that organizations willing to challenge conventional assumptions about expertise and value could achieve results that seemed impossible using traditional approaches. The veteran who had been dismissed as Grandpa had become a CEO, whose leadership principles were being studied and implemented by companies across multiple industries. But the transformation's most significant impact wasn't professional recognition or business success. It was personal reconciliation with family relationships that had been strained by years of misunderstanding about the value of military service. David and Lisa now understood that their father's experience represented valuable expertise rather than time away from family, creating opportunities for connection and mutual respect that hadn't existed before. Peterson Tech's crisis forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions. The foundation I'd established had placed 2,847 veterans in meaningful civilian positions, while the Peterson Tech model had been implemented by organizations employing over 50,000 people. The ripple effects of Operation Supply Bridge continued expanding, creating opportunities and changing perspectives about expertise and value that would influence organizational culture for years to come. As evening approached and Peterson Tech's facility grew quiet, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The humiliation of being dismissed as Grandpa had triggered a sequence of events that proved knowledge and experience could triumph over arrogance and narrow thinking when properly applied. The crisis that could have destroyed Peterson Tech had instead transformed it into something better than anyone had imagined possible. More importantly, our success had created a model that other organizations could follow to unlock potential they didn't know they possessed. The company that had nearly failed because it couldn't recognize the value of experience had become a demonstration of what was possible when expertise was truly leveraged rather than marginalized. The transformation was complete, but its influence would continue expanding as other organizations learned to value knowledge from every available source. If you've ever felt underestimated because of your age, your background, or your unconventional experience, remember that expertise has value regardless of its packaging. The knowledge you've gained through years of experience, the relationships you've built through service and dedication, and the wisdom you've accumulated through challenges and failures. These are assets that no amount of education or innovation can replace. Share your own stories of overcoming dismissal and proving your worth in the comments below. The world needs to hear about the victories that happen when experience and determination triumph over prejudice and narrow thinking. Like and subscribe if this story resonated with you, because everyone deserves to understand that their knowledge has value, regardless of what others might think about its source or presentation.